Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
This week, James and I are on the road at Basis Scottsdale, a charter school in Scottsdale, Arizona, where we're talking to economics and government students about trade and the disturbing fact that world trade, and specifically trade in the United States, has been declining over the past decade. We apologize to our listeners, but as we're traveling and appearing live, we have neither quick hits nor foolishness of the week this week. No doubt, over the next few days, James will find plenty of foolish things to bring to us next time. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. If you're a full-time college student looking for something educational, fun, and free, apply to join me and James and several faculty who have appeared on Words and Numbers at the inaugural summer seminar on the theory and practice of classical liberalism. The week-long seminar is hosted by the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University and will be held June 5th through the 10th. There's no charge, and meals and lodging are provided. To apply, see the link in the show notes. What we want to talk about today is this disturbing trend that's been going on for maybe 12 years, not just in the United States but worldwide, of a growing isolationism, or in the old days you'd call it mercantilism. Mercantilism a couple centuries ago was this economic theory, if you want to call it that the way to prosper as a country is to export as much as you can so that you got lots of gold money coming in, and don't import so that you don't have much gold going out, much money going out. The idea is you accumulate all of this money, and that's good. And of course, that whole idea is defunct. Well, it's defunct amongst economists. You'll still find non-economists who will say words, and if you think about the words they're saying, what they have in the back of their mind is this mercantilism.
Well, but politicians love this.
Politicians love it,
right? And
right.
They call it trade deficits.
That's right.
We have to talk about
that we're
this.
buying more from the Chinese, and the Chinese are buying from us. And
that's, I think, on the level of common sense, there's something that rings correct about this. And that's the problem, right? It's an easy case to make.
It makes sense at first glance because you picture in your mind all of these dollars leaving the U.S. and going to China and no dollars coming back. And you picture yourself, well, if that were me, all of a sudden I'd be poor because I'd have no dollars.
All right, hold the phone, though, because it is every one of you, right? If you think about your lives, right, what do? You wander around buying stuff. So you go to the Walmart and you buy something, and then you go to the Walmart again and you buy something else. And before you know it, you've spent like $800 at the Walmart. How much money does Walmart spend at your store?
Yes.
You never ever get anything back. But that's true literally of every place you spend money. So you have a trade deficit with every single place that you spend money.
And James has done something interesting here that I would encourage you to do. Anytime you want to think about trade, step away from the idea of countries. People say things like the United States trades with China. The United States doesn't trade with China. People and businesses in the United States trade with people and businesses in China. So scale the whole thing down and look at yourself. You buy and sell things with other people. You buy things from the store, you go work with your employer, you're selling your labor, you get income from that. And all of that phenomena that are going on is the same thing as going on at a country level. When we talk about United States trading with China, it's the same thing. So as James says, if you're not concerned that you spend more money at Walmart than Walmart spends in your household, similarly, you shouldn't be concerned if the United States buys more stuff from China than China buys from the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's the flip side of it, right? My employer pays me.
Right,
I don't pay my employer.
Exactly. So you've got a trade surplus with your employer.
With my employer, that's right. And the more you start to think this through, this is common sense.
Now, one of the things that people will say in response is they'll say, okay, well, look, I understand I've got to take into account not just what the United States buys from China, but what other countries buy from us. And suppose I do that. I look at all of the countries that we buy things from, and I add all that up. That's dollars leaving the United States. And I look at all of the countries that buy things from us, and I add all that up, and that's dollars coming into the United States. What happens if the total amount of dollars leaving the U.S. is bigger than the total amount of dollars coming in? And they say, that's the problem.
Yep, there you go.
That's a trade deficit, that in total, we've got more dollars leaving the country.
And that also sounds like a pretty
That
good
sounds
observation
reasonable,
there.
right.
That's right. That sounds good.
And what it's missing is that those excess dollars that leave the country do come back. But they don't come back necessarily in the form of us selling goods and services. They come back in the form of us selling financial instruments. Foreigners will use those excess dollars to buy stock and bonds in American companies. They'll buy bonds that are issued by the U.S. Treasury. When all the dust settles, every dollar that leaves does come back. It just doesn't all come back in the form of people buying goods and services. It comes back in the form of people buying equity and bonds in American companies.
People start waving their hands about, and they say things like, the Chinese will own everything in the United States within 5 years.
That's right. And this goes back to when we were in college.
We laugh at this because, and you guys will too, because it was the Japanese who were doing it when we were younger.
Yeah.
Oh my God, the Japanese will own everything in the next 10 years.
Yeah, because what was happening is we were buying more from Japan than Japan was buying from us, so the excess dollars are leaving the country, they're going to Japan. And what's Japan doing with these excess dollars? They're buying American financial assets.
And properties.
And properties, yeah. And so everybody's saying, oh my God, Japan's going to end up owning everything. They're going to own all the companies. We're all going to be working for Japan because Japan will own all of the US companies. Again, that sounds reasonable. But remember, countries just like people will export the thing that they're particularly good at doing. And what are Americans particularly good at doing? We're particularly good at doing a bunch of things, like other people are as well. But one of the things at which Americans excel is entrepreneurship. We're particularly good at being entrepreneurs. Now, you can't export entrepreneurship, but you can export the fruit of entrepreneurship, and that's companies. We found companies here. Sure, sell them to the Japanese. It doesn't matter because we can make more. We're entrepreneurs. We'll create more companies and we'll sell those too. And all of a sudden you see that this business about we're buying more stuff from the rest of the world than they're buying from us, and they're using these excess dollars to buy American companies, that's perfectly fine. What we're doing is exporting companies.
But it's more than perfectly fine. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's great.
It's what you should want. People see it as a real problem, and then when you ask them to give some evidence, where's the evidence that things are horrible as a result? They come up with things like, well, I know a guy who lost his job. The anecdotal sort of stories about people who get left behind.
You have to be very careful about this with economics. Unlike the physical sciences where truths are deterministic, in economics, truths are stochastic. A deterministic truth is true every single time. You bring two objects closer together and the gravitational force between them is larger, whatever it is. I'm not a physicist, right? But it's true every single time. It's deterministic. In economics, truths are stochastic. They may not be true every single time, but they're true on average. So if you raise the minimum wage, the economic truth is you will create unemployment amongst low-skilled workers. Now, can you point to a particular low-skilled worker who didn't lose his job? Yes, you can. Can you point to, in the case of trade, a particular person who's worse off because of trade? Yes, you can. But when you put all the people together, you find on average, the people who are better off because of trade far outweigh the number who are worse off. When you raise the minimum wage, low-skilled workers who lose their jobs far outweigh those that keep or gain jobs. And so it's a stochastic truth. It's true on average.
And what you end up seeing is, and I don't want to throw a bomb at Donald Trump, but he was particularly bad about this sort of thing. You find that they take a look at trade and they say, I can make a lot of hay here, and they're all smart enough to know better. I think they all know that what they're saying is a batch of hot nonsense. And yet they say it anyway. And there's this interesting story. Vernon Smith, an economist we met who won the Nobel Prize, is very important, got invited to the White House. I believe George W. Bush. Vernon wanted to talk about the steel tariff. And he leaned in and he said, you know, President Bush, I don't want to speak out of school, but this steel tariff that you're pushing is not going to be terribly helpful. And George Bush leaned back and said, Professor, you take care of the economics. I got the politics. What a colossal admission that is, that a steel tariff that was really doing some damage, not only here but globally, was a political ploy.
Yeah, and the arguments the politicians would give are all economic.
That's right.
When in fact, the real motivation is political.
So I throw this bomb at Donald Trump, and yet you said earlier, 12 years or so that we've been thinking about trade fairness might be the best way to put it. I don't want to say fair trade because that's just a single aspect of the overall thing. But we have collectively been thinking about this sort of thing. You say 12 years, I'm thinking maybe closer to 20. I remember back in the 80s, we were talking about trade with South Africa, right, and how we shouldn't do that. So I think there's been elements of this for a long, long time.
There have been, and they take different forms. So it was back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was trade deficits everyone's concerned about. So we should do something about trade. We should not have free trade because it results in trade deficits. And then you get maybe a decade or so later, I'm thinking the early 2000s, this push, particularly on college campuses, for fair trade.
Fair trade, right.
So it's not that we shouldn't trade, but rather it's that we should trade in such a way that we benefit certain people because of certain reasons, whatever it is. And it's a restriction on trade. Nonetheless, it sounds nice, fair trade. And then you get a couple decades later, the buy local movement. You should buy locally. And you go to restaurants now and they'll tell you all our stuff is locally sourced or whatever it is. Buy local is simply a push back against trade. All that happens when you trade with somebody is that we've drawn a line on a map and we've said that the transaction that crosses that line we're going to call trade. Transactions that don't cross that line we won't call trade. So you all, we're here in Arizona, you don't think, I'm sure, about your trade deficit with Pennsylvania, where I live. It's kind of weird to even think about it. Well, the only difference between you buying something from someone in Pennsylvania and you buying something from someone in Mexico is that somebody drew a line on a map and said these two places are different and these two other places aren't. When you look at the economics, there's nothing different there. What you should be doing with trade or buying and selling or whatever it is the same thing that you do as individuals. Now, you're here in school. You're studying stuff so that you can go to college. And when you get to college, you're going to study a particular thing. You're going to become good at this thing. And then you're going to go get a job. And you're going to get paid to do the thing that you've been trained to do, that you're particularly good at. What are you not going to do? You're not going to sew your own clothes. You're not going to grow your own food. You're not going to make your own furniture. You're going to be a financial analyst, or you're going to be a teacher, or whatever it is you do. And how will you get your clothing and your food and your house? You will buy them from people whose expertise is in producing those things. In other words, you do at an individual level exactly what countries should do. Specialize your efforts, your resources into the production of the thing you're good at. Let other people produce the things you aren't good at and trade with them.
So when you hear things like, we're going to make American manufacturing great again, why?
Right. If we're not good at it, we're not good at it. Do the thing you're good at.
And not good at it doesn't quite cover it either, right? If we can't compete at it, we might be great at it, but it costs us 9 times as much to do it. Should we try to make American manufacturing great again? Is that a reasonable thing to want to accomplish? Politicians take it as an article of faith that they can say those words and people will nod their heads in assent.
Yeah, and remember this rule. If you're not understanding it at the level of countries, scale it down to the level of an individual because it works the same way. Saying something like, we need to make the United States better at manufacturing, is like saying to yourself, I'm good at math, but I really need to make myself better at music. Why? If you're good at math, go get employed as a mathematician. Why waste your time developing a skill that you're not good at? Let me say something about manufacturing before we get off of that topic, because this is something that people say a lot, that the manufacturing industry has been declining and we're in decline and we were much better off when we were better at manufacturing, this kind of thing. There is no decline in American manufacturing. It's quite the reverse. We've become really good at manufacturing. Here's why people say it's in decline. They look at the number of Americans who are employed in the manufacturing industry. And that number today, and I'm going to do this off the top of my head, so don't quote me, but approximately I'm right. The number of Americans employed in manufacturing industries today is about 1/2 what it was back in the 1950s and 60s. 1/2. People look at that and say, look, we've lost half of the American jobs in manufacturing. Yeah, but if you look at manufacturing output, our manufacturing output has tripled over that same period. We're producing 3 times as much using half the labor. We're not bad at manufacturing. We're really stinking good at it. We're 6 times better at it today than we were back in the 50s and 60s.
And that becomes the problem, and people have washed out of these industries.
Yeah, and that goes back to your political statement. What's the problem? You lose half of the jobs in manufacturing, you've lost half of the people who would vote for a politician who supports manufacturing.
That's right. Let's go back 100, 150 years, and let's think about horses and buggies. When automobiles came along, all those buggy makers were out of business.
Yep.
Every last one of them. So were all the dudes who took care of horses.
Yep.
So were the people who made riding crops and reins and bits, leather workers, farm workers. Boy, there was a lot of people ended up out of work. Is that a good reason to tell Henry Ford that he can't make his cars? That seems unreasonable to me, right?
Yeah, and there's an asymmetry there that's the problem. And that is when Henry Ford comes along with the automobile, you can see very clearly whose jobs are going to be lost. All those people who raise horses, who take care of them, who shoe them, who make the whatever it is, the tackle that goes on, all of them, they're out of work and they may not get work again. And we can point to them. We can say, this is why the automobile is bad. Who can you not point to? You can't point to the people who construct and work at drive-thrus, the Jiffy Lubes, they change your oil, the car dealerships, the tire manufacturers. You can't point to them because they don't exist yet. You have to imagine them. And so you've got this asymmetry where you can point to the losers. They're sitting right there in front of you. They're real human beings, but you can't point to the winners because they don't exist yet. They're hypothetical. But it happens every single time there's an invention. And James is talking about inventions, but the same phenomenon occurs with trade. When we talk about we're going to buy more stuff from Mexican manufacturers, and we can point to Americans who are going to lose their jobs and say, these people are going to lose their jobs, but you can't point to the ones who are going to gain jobs because of these goods that are coming in at a lower cost because they're hypothetical. But they do exist. They will exist.
I think people want trade to be fair. This is the language of their minds.
Yeah.
And they think somehow trade isn't fair. Economists have a simple observation. If I buy something from Dana and I give him money and he gives me the thing, we just traded. And I can tell you that we both wanted that trade. It worked for both of us. How do I know this? Because we just did. And if it weren't good for one of us or both of us, we wouldn't. Now, you can be wrong from time to time.
By definition, it's fair.
In a condition of free trade, every trade is fair.
Yeah.
Because we both agreed to it freely. Any musicians in the room? Guitars are expensive. I loved buying guitars from crackheads.
Did you say crackheads?
I did. Because with crackheads, everything's always on sale.
Oh my God.
You get a really good price if you've got just enough cash. That's a form of duress that the crackhead is under. You can make a case, I think, that that's not exactly a free choice because he's already enslaved to this other thing that he keeps buying and putting into his body. Nonetheless, that was a choice too, a freely made choice. You know, when people get down on free trade, they look at people who are maybe in lousy situation, people who are out of work, who have to sell off possessions to pay the rent and things like this. And yeah, that's a lousy situation. And yet, if I'm out of work and I'm selling things to you to pay my rent and you're buying them, I'm still better off.
If you weren't, you wouldn't be selling them.
I'm still better off,
Yep.
right? Even in a bad situation, the trade itself is still a positive good in my life. Maybe not the good I wanted, but nonetheless a positive good. And when you look at both sides of trade, what you always see are two people who are made better off as a result of it.
And so go back to fair trade, which sounds good, but the problem comes down to how do you define fair? And the economists will argue that there's only one possible definition in any practical sense, and that is that the two people willingly exchanged. Now, would the guy who's paying rather pay less? Sure. Would the guy who's selling rather get more? Sure. But the fact is, they found some price that they could at least both say, okay, I'll take this, I'm better off. That's the only thing you could point to that can indicate that the trade was fair or not. Think about coffee for a moment, because when fair trade
is almost always about coffee.
Yeah, it started off being about coffee. It was very much, it kind of got its the major press from doing the coffee thing. And on college campuses across the country, when Fair Trade Week comes around, everybody's got their fair trade coffee in their hand, right? So think about this for a minute, because the argument is, look, we're helping these coffee growers in developing countries by buying their coffee. It's making them better off. This is a fair trade. We're going to pay a premium to help them out. And there's all kinds of details here that I'm going to gloss over, but let's assume that all of that is true, that it actually is helping them out. And you say, well, this is a good thing, right? We're helping them. Stop and think about what you've just done. If the only reason I'm buying coffee from these growers is because I want to help them out, then by definition, they're not very good at this coffee, right? Because if they were good, if they were producing quality coffee at a low price, you wouldn't have to convince me to buy it. I'd be buying it automatically. If you got to convince me to buy it, there's something going on here that this must not be the thing that they're particularly good at. So think this through. What resources would you use to grow coffee that you could also use to grow something else? And the answer of the something else is cocoa. The same kind of environment, same kind of tools, the same kind of skills that you would use to grow coffee, you could use to grow cocoa. So if I've got this developing country and I put on this big push, let's buy coffee from them, I divert their resources out of the production of cocoa into the production of coffee. It could well be the case that they actually have an advantage in the production of cocoa. I've just caused them to direct their resources away from the thing they're actually good at toward a thing that they aren't necessarily good at. And the sad thing is, I feel good about myself in doing this, saying, well, I've helped these developing country farmers, when in fact I've actually caused them long-term harm, because the minute the whole fair trade thing goes away, it's no longer being hyped, and I'm looking around to buy coffee, and yeah, I've had that coffee from those developing countries, but you know what, it's not that good, and it costs 20% more. I'm going to buy something else. And all of a sudden, there's no support for them now. And now they're going out of business when they could have remained in business had they just been producing a different crop, a crop that they actually were good at producing.
You have to realize there's a lot of money at stake here. These third world countries were hiring lobbyists to get fair trade policies enacted. The goal here was first to get it into the public's mind and then to get it into policy, that we won't buy things that don't have a fair trade label. The first question I've got is, who owns the label?
Yeah, right.
Who gets to say, yes, you get the fair trade label? Because if there's malfeasance, and there's always malfeasance, that's where it's going to be. Mm-hmm. You're going to find all kinds of graft around this certification. And what do you find? You find people fighting for the certification because they know their farm will do a lot of business if they get it and almost none if they don't. And that's when the bribery happens. Because
it turns out the guy who makes the label, he's the one that's getting the bulk of the money.
It's kind of like, knowing that the guy who made the most money in the California gold rush was Levi Strauss. Mm-hmm. The guy who made the pants that everybody wore.
Right, yeah.
It often falls to functionaries when they get to declare who's going to win and who's not going to win. Mm. When does that not happen? In a perfectly free market. Do you get the outcomes you want if you're a certain kind of American liberal in a perfectly free market? Well, no. Conservatives don't get their preferred outcome either. Your preferred outcome has nothing to do with it. The preferred outcome of the consumer and the seller.
Of the people who are involved
in the market. That's the preferred outcome that you get. And what do you find? You find people looking at a trade saying, well, that's not fair to the farmer. Meanwhile, the farmer's saying, really? What you're saying is we have to pay more for this product, which means that customers have to get charged more for this product. Mm-hmm. They're passing along a price to customers.
I have found that people who will follow the argument that we've laid out to you will say, okay, I buy all of this, free trade's a good thing, except when a foreign country is subsidizing exports to the US. So think about steel, for example. In a purely free trade environment, suppose American steel is better, lower priced than Chinese steel. I don't know that this is the case, but let's suppose it is. Better quality, lower price than the steel that Chinese can make, and so people are going to buy American steel. And along comes China, and China subsidizes its steel. So it puts money on the table that a ton of Chinese steel that you would normally pay, I don't know how the prices work, let's say $100 for, I guess that's kind of low for a ton of steel, isn't it? A certain amount of steel that you would pay $100 for. China, the government, is going to subsidize that, so you don't have to pay 100, you only have to pay 80. And people will say, well, that's not fair. If China is subsidizing the steel exports to the US, the U.S. government should do something to protect the American steel manufacturers.
I agree. It's not fair. It's not fair to the Chinese people.
It's not fair to the Chinese taxpayers.
I'm going to buy all that steel that I can.
Yeah. Scale it down to understand it. Imagine that you were going to buy stuff at Walmart and you want to buy, what do we have here? I've got this nice phone, and you're going to buy one of these phones from Walmart, and everybody else sells these phones for $100. And you go to Walmart, and Walmart will sell it to you for $80, which is actually below cost. And how are they doing that? They're doing it by actually taking money from their stockholders putting money into Walmart, and the returns that would otherwise go to the stockholders, subsidizing this so you can buy it for $80. What's happening there? You're benefiting because you're getting this thing for $80. Who's paying? Who's paying is Walmart stockholders. In this analogy, those stockholders are the taxpayers in China. They're the ones who are paying for the cheap steel that we're getting. Are American steel manufacturers in trouble? Sure they are. They can't compete with this steel. But you know who isn't in trouble? American car manufacturers. Because they can buy the steel at 20% off, courtesy of the Chinese taxpayer, produce cars and sell them to you for 20% less, which is good for the American consumer.
And so to appliance makers, I mean, there's a million different answers here. Yeah, you have to be careful, right? Because most of what we talked about today are matters of taxation. And we're not here to tell you that taxation is illegitimate. It's not. Certain forms, I think, are counterproductive, and other forms are very, very smart. I mean, I hate taxes personally, and I wish I never had to pay them. But I don't think taxes are illegitimate. Trade is going to bring with it some form of taxation on some level. Should it look like the subsidies that we now have? Should it look like the punishments that we now have for other disfavored products? Think sin taxes, so tobacco, alcohol, things like this. Marijuana now, a legal product, getting taxed into oblivion. The taxes on marijuana in California are so high that it makes more sense to buy from illegal street dealers. It's actually cheaper to buy illegal marijuana in California because the California government just can't help it. They tax everything.
I want to explain, which we did not do at the outset, why we think this topic is particularly important right now. Since 2011, world trade, and let me tell you how we measure this when we talk about trade, we measure exports plus imports as a fraction of GDP. So if you picture your economy, what slice of your economy is due to trade? World trade as a fraction of GDP has declined 5% since 2011. There should be more trade. In the United States, trade since 2011 has declined 20%. And there's a long-term trend upward. If we had continued that long-term trend upward since 2011 and compare that to where we are now, we're down 30%. There's 30% less trade going on today between the United States and the rest of the world as there would have been if our long-term trend had continued.
How much of that do you think is directly attributable to the COVID issues?
What you find, if you look at the data, is worldwide, it was the 2008 housing crisis that was bad enough in the US, but that also had ramifications for the rest of the world in terms of finances. World trade and US trade plummeted after that. But then it took about 2 years to come back up again. 2011 was the peak, and then it started coming down again. Dropped down significantly with COVID, bounced back a bit. But the bounce back is nowhere near the downturn since 2011.
So the trend that we're seeing now was evident prior to COVID?
Yes.
And we've returned to that trend?
Well, it's unclear because the upward movement is only 1 year old so far.
So we've got to wait a couple of years.
Yeah, but the downward trend in the United States since 2011, it's almost straight line down.
And notice what just happened. When people say, well, the data show that this is clearly what's going on. No, the data don't show that, not for years. It's 2023 right now. We're probably dealing with 2019 or 2020.
Yeah, I've got the latest data I have in front of me is 2021.
But usually by the time you get to issues right this second, you're going to have to wait 2 or 3 years to have clear answers about what's going on or what was going on.
Right.
What you can do now is always in the realm of conjecture.
So the story here is the evidence is very clear, not only across countries, but across time. Societies that trade more do better on all sorts of metrics. It's not just income. They do better in terms of income inequality. There are exceptions, but the general trend is countries that trade more tend to have lower levels of income inequality, tend to have lower levels of gender inequality.
Better environmental outcomes.
Their environmental outcomes tend to be better. All sorts of things that you would associate with a healthy society tend to be positively correlated with trade. Now, I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship there, but I am saying that there's something important going on that we need to think about. And we need to think carefully before we start saying things like we need to be careful of trade deficits, or we want fair trade, or we want to buy local. Be really careful about that, because there's some kind of important ramification that's going on. If it's not causal, there's something else that's causing both of them together, of a prosperous society and a society that trades.